Okay, Craig, we have some more questions that are a little more lighthearted to show your personality. We wanted to know what inspired you to become a speech pathologist and what did that process look for you?
This is a really good question. So I actually started off in pre-med as a freshman. I also was a baseball player as a freshman. And so pre-med and baseball did not go very well together from a GPA standpoint. I also didn't really, I liked the classes that I was taking in pre-med for the most part, but I didn't like all of the science. I wanted to do something where I was like, had some science and healthcare, but also was working with people on a little bit deeper level, I guess. Um, I guess early in my sophomore year, I had a meeting with my advisor to kind of talk about all of this, and he was about 10 or 15 minutes late. And so while he was not there, I just walked around his waiting room and I started looking at brochures for different programs. And I picked up the one for speech pathology and I looked at it and I said, this might be interesting. So when he came in, I said, I think I want to try a couple of classes in this and see how it goes. And I guess I took my first one probably not till I was a fall of my junior year. And then I worked all of them in junior and senior year. But as soon as I started taking them, I realized that was what I wanted to do.
Wow, something actually very similar happened to me as well. And it's amazing how when things are meant to be, it will happen.
Yeah. So what was your story?
So I was a little bit confused because I loved the sciences. I loved math. So I went in as open to engineering and also biology. And then I was more interested in the neurological side of biology. So I did a concentration in neuroscience as a psychology major. But then I also loved music. I had so many different interests, to be honest. But what actually really got me interested was the sensory side of the speech and hearing field. So more towards audiology. And then also the singing science, so singing pathology. And that's mostly what I do my research in. And it just opened me up to so many other sides of the field that I fell in love with. And there's no going back now, but it's just amazing how things can happen.
Yeah, it's well, you may both of you may experience this as well because you're so into autism right now. But if you would have asked me also when I finished grad school, what's the one area of the field that you won't get into, I probably would have told you stuttering.
Really?
Which is kind of fascinating too. I mean, so I guess you never say never. When I started my first job, I was the new person. They said, hey, we have a couple kids who stutter on the waiting list and you need to see them. And I was like, okay. So I really, didn't have much interest in it, but as I started to see those kids, I really got interested in it and started to really love doing it and kind of really enjoyed the individual aspect of seeing them. It's not like, treating an R where you treat an R fairly similarly, in different cases. With people who stutter, much like people who have autism, every story is just so different in how they got there. So I really like that aspect of it.
Yeah, it's kind of nice to know that you can walk into something completely new and different every day, and it's a constant challenge and a constant learning experience. And that kind of goes to show how individualized therapy is so crucial and important within our field. So I'm excited and look forward to what might happen in the future. I know that we're very early on in our careers, so who knows what might fall into place later on.
Well, I think for you as well, you two have both, done a lot of advocacy work already. So I think for you, this story is going to be too, how do you keep doing that as a speech pathologist? And, for me, I got into doing things at ASHA and doing, committees and doing things within our state organization in Pennsylvania very early in my career. And I think that was a really good thing to do because it kept me into doing these other things just outside of my normal workday.
That's
Great.
fantastic.
And kind of along the lines of pursuing the speech pathology career, what words of encouragement would you give to other males who are thinking of pursuing speech pathology, especially since it's such a woman-dominated field?
Yeah, I've always tried to figure out why that is, and I think that the numbers are actually fairly similar to what they are in like elementary education as well. And I think it's the young children fear, maybe. I don't know, but I think there's so many things that you can do as a speech pathologist that I don't think that um, I don't really see it as a gender issue, because it's interesting that about 94-95% of our field is female, but about 70 to 75% of the patients we work with are male. When you look at the numbers in terms of male to female ratios of communication disorders. So I think there is a huge need. And honestly, I do feel like with stuttering, I work with a lot of teenage boys, right? And so that it does make it a little bit easier to know what to talk about sometimes, having once been a teenage boy. That they like video games, they like wrestling, they like, sports, and that's the stuff that I liked as a teenager. So, I think that it does make it a little bit easier to connect with people to some degree if you have that background too. And certainly our field needs diversity. We
Yeah.
need gender diversity, we need ethnic diversity, racial diversity, and cultural diversity. And I think that anything we can do to promote that is good.
Absolutely. And that's something that Francesca and I have talked about a few different times, that diversity is so important. And that's why we were so anxious to ask you this question, because we can certainly see how a young adult who's a male might be intimidated by entering the field, if they have the perception that it's just a field for women to pursue, or I don't know if there's any other field that are more attractive to a young man. So we would love to see more males and, like you said, more cultural diversity and ethnic diversity in our field as well.
I had a really interesting experience as a grad student, and it really kind of hit the gender issue hard for me, because it was my first clinical placement as a first-year grad student, my first semester. And we were working with this young man who just had a stroke. He was 22 years old. And we had my supervisor and I who had to go in and evaluate him. And my supervisor was a woman. And I went in, and it did not go well when I went in there. He was very angry and upset and didn't do anything that I asked him to do. And then my supervisor walked in the room, did the exact same things, and it was completely different, the outcome. And she came out and she said, "Well, what do you think?" And I said, "Well, I'm a little frustrated, to be honest." Because I thought I did everything in there that was right. And she said, "So why do you think that he reacted the way he did?" And I said, "I have no idea." And she said, "Well, think about it for a second." And I did, and I still had no idea, because I was young and didn't really think about those things on that level as a first semester grad student. And she said, "Okay, he's a 22-year-old male who just had a stroke. So you just walked into his room as a 22-year-old male who did not. And so when he sees that right now, he's seeing you as his old normal. And he's not ready to deal with that yet." And I was like, wow, that's probably true. And like, I never had even thought about that as a grad student. And I think, that's always kind of stuck in my head, that learning experience, because I think that's a good example of how you need diversity, because you may have a patient who just for no reason at all doesn't respond to somebody just because of who they are. Mm-hmm. No fault of the person going in the room trying to do the evaluation, but they may respond to somebody else just because they don't have that emotional connection to that person.
We actually see the same thing happen at the school I work with, because with autism, the majority of those who are diagnosed are boys. Mm-hmm. So a lot of the times all the speech pathologists are female. And if they're really having a major crisis moment, the person we call is this big, burly guy who's able to kind of lay down the law and put things in place. And you're totally right. Sometimes we do need a little bit more diversity, and not just with stuttering, but with autism too, because they might be able to relate to their caretaker a little bit more.
So one of the other interesting stories I remember having as a clinician, and this was after I already had a little bit of an experience. So, I mean, it was my take on it was completely different, and I had a good idea of what was going on. So, most of the kids that I work with, just because, again, the male-female ratio are boys. But I mean, obviously over the years, I've seen a lot of girls who stutter as well, and all of them have gone pretty well. So I was working with this girl one time who was maybe about 14, 15 years old, and she came into the room and she sat down in her first session and she just kind of put her hand down like this. And I said, come on, like, this is going to be okay. Like, we're going to have fun. She's like, no, we're not. And I said, look, I'm a fun person. We're going to have fun. And she said, you and I have nothing in common. And I said, okay, tell me some things that you like to do, and we'll see if we have anything in common. She said, okay, I like to go to the mall. I like to talk to boys on the phone, and I like to climb trees. And I said, yeah, we don't have anything in common. But we still managed to get through it after that a little while, and be okay. But I do think that's an important discussion to have as the people you're working with get a little bit older, because you do have to know the blind spots that are possible in your relationship, and you're just not gonna, like, initially. A 15-year-old girl probably isn't going to feel as comfortable telling me the same things as a 15-year-old boy would. Now, eventually, I think they get to that point, but you have to know the process might look a little bit different.
Right. And I feel like you brought up a really good point, because as you said with the evaluation experience, that not every client that you encounter will connect with you perfectly, but sometimes you don't have a choice or the liberty to kind of move them around to other better fits personality wise. So that's why building rapport and building a relationship with your clients and the people that you serve is so important. So I know as a first semester graduate student, the first few sessions I was like ready to go, and I had all my cards ready and had my treatment planned all figured out, but my professors kind of said, okay, well, you can still take a day or two to just build some rapport, build a relationship, gain their trust. And I think that's the most important thing, is to show them that they can trust you, and that although you might not have all the similarities and you're kind of on a different playing field, that you're there to help them and to kind of let them feel that trust and honesty between the two of you.
So that's a really interesting example, because I remember as a grad student, my supervisors and I having that very same discussion, right, about like the importance of building rapport and take a couple sessions to do that, and me being like, okay. My students now, though, I feel like have a really hard time with that sometimes. Like, but what am I going to collect data on? And I'm like, nothing. So you have to have that foundation, though, in order to be successful later. So like, if you want to have better data at session 10, you take the first couple sessions to establish that relationship, or you could start taking data now and your data is not going to look as good at session 10. And I think sometimes that's a hard thing for people to wrap their mind around, because I think we have in some ways created people who are sometimes a little too data driven, and don't focus on the personal connection side of it too.
Absolutely. So we were also wondering, what is something that you might want our viewers to understand about speech pathology or stuttering that they might not already know about it?
Well, I think with stuttering, the biggest myths that are out there are that people who stutter are more nervous or more anxious than other people, and they're not. I mean, they probably are more anxious about communicating, but that's because they stutter. There's people who stutter have the same level of intelligence. They're not any more nervous or anxious. I often get the question from parents of, well, how should I react to his stuttering? And I always say, well, you should react to it like you would somebody else just talking to you. I mean, I think that's hard for some people, because your natural tendency is to want to jump in and help when you feel like people are struggling. So if somebody is in a block, it's even hard sometimes for people to maintain their right body posture and eye contact and things like that, where they don't, kind of get up in their chair and move forward and like feel like they're going to jump in and help them. But I mean, the best thing that you can do is you can just be patient. I mean, I think you can be accepting, you can be patient, you can give people the time they need, and you can create an environment where people understand that it's okay to be who they are. And, I always say that that's probably the thing that working with people who stutter taught me very early on in my career, and I've always been grateful for that, is that, everybody is different, and people it's really important for people to be who they are and not feel like they have to hide it. So I think that's an important part. I think for speech pathology in general, I think it's just understanding the breadth of what we do, that we do a lot of different things, and that we make a significant impact on people's ability to communicate. And that's really important for people on a day-to-day basis. I mean, what better indicator of quality of life than how much you can communicate with people? And I think you're seeing that a little bit now.
I was just thinking that.
Where people don't have that, day-to-day personal interaction with people, and it's being very hard on some people not having that.
Right. And the guest that we had last week, Brittany Marcolini, she kind of hit on that topic too, where now we're kind of starting to see how difficult it is for those who do not have the immediate access to communication, or not in the same way that that we all have, or that if you don't have a communication disorder, you don't generally have those troubles. So now we're kind of starting to see, whenever those things are taken away from us, how hard it actually is, and how it's really integral into the human experience of communicating with each other.
Yeah, absolutely. Totally agree.
And something I noticed too is you pointed out the keyword acceptance.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, advocacy is very important. Education is very important, but so is acceptance. And that is something that we should all be striving for, just as people in general, regardless of our profession. But you already shared a few really great stories as a clinician, but I want to know, what is your favorite memory as a speech pathologist?
Mm-hmm. Gosh, it's hard to pin this down. I was involved in helping to do, when I was at Marshall, we ran a stuttering summer camp for about 5 years. And that's something that will probably be starting up here at Edinboro when we can. we could be face-to-face and do summer camps again. But I really have enjoyed doing that. That's really, I think, got to a point where we did it with our students. Another faculty member who's a good colleague, Mary Widener, and I did that together. Seeing the students get to experience what it's like to be a person who stutters and kind of go through that experience with the kids, I think was probably the best teaching moment that you can possibly have. You could talk about things all day in a class, but I think when people actually see it in action. And one of the neat things was we always had that camp in the summer, and my class was in the spring. And so for them to then have the class and then go to the camp, I think was sort of like, oh my gosh, like you were right about all this stuff. and I think it's really eye-opening for them to have that experience. And I think just seeing the amount of progress that the kids would make, not in being fluent, but in their acceptance of who they are during that 3 or 4 day period was always amazing. It was certainly one of the more satisfying moments of my career, probably, those experiences.
Right. And I feel like we can all kind of relate to that we've been in a position before that we've felt like we've had to hide a part of who we are, or cover it up with something to sound or look or appear different than what we are. And it's unfortunate that we've all kind of had that kind of experience, but by sharing that acceptance is key, and by helping empower people to be who they are and to own it and just go about your day and not worry about what the perceptions might be is really important for, like Francesca said, not just in autism and not just in stuttering, but just for people in general.
Yeah, and I think so much of that is important for the students to learn too, not just the clients. I mean, it's certainly really important for the clients, but I think as a graduate student, right? I mean, that's really important to learn, because I think, that helps you develop as a clinician and knowing what's important for the client. But I also think it's important for you as a clinician to understand that about yourself as a clinician moving forward to be really good.
Absolutely. What are some tips and advice that you could share about time management, since you do juggle so many roles and you've been in a lot of high positions within departments at universities?
So I think a couple things. I think number one is, in order to be efficient, it's really important not to be a perfectionist. And there's good enough to be done, and then there's perfect. And if you're attaining perfection all the time, that's going to be really hard. So I think you have to understand, like, and I also think, as you know, as grad students, there's what would be nice to get done today versus what has to be done today. And there are some things that yes would be nice to get done today, but you also have to allow yourself to be at a place where mentally and physically you can get the most done. And so, when people say like, oh, I was up until 3 a.m. doing this, that's going to probably hurt your efficiency in the long run, because then the next day you're not going to get anything done. So, I think that making sure that you are taking care of yourself to some degree, and then, just allowing yourself to know that there are going to be times where you're going to make a mistake. There's going to be times where you're going to have to delegate something. There's going to be times where you're going to have to just trust other people to do their thing. I think, those are the probably the top ones. And then I just think also not getting very far behind. I think, as much as you can stay on the small tasks that you can check off every day, the better off you'll be, because those bigger tasks are the ones that take time that you can't do within 10 minutes. But there are things you can do within 10 minutes to reel off 3 or 4 quick things and then not have to come back to them later.
Those are some really great tips that I've been learning throughout this journey as being a student. So Spectrum Sundays focuses mostly on autism awareness. And to wrap everything up, what are some general accommodations that you think that people can make to help individuals with autism feel more equal in the classroom or even in the community?
Yeah, so I mean, I think, from a community standpoint, I think it's a lot of what we've talked about already, which is being accepting. And I think in the classroom, I think that same thing applies. But one of the things that I think has worked very well, that we've done in stuttering a lot, that I think works well with everything, is to make sure that people in the classroom are educated. And that is the other students too. So, the more you try to pretend something is not there, the worse it usually goes. The more you can have direct discussions about it and talk about, hey, this is why Joey does this a little differently. But that's okay, because Johnny does something else differently. And I think just having those general discussions about individual differences and individual characteristics throughout the year is so important. And again, I think that people make mistake by doing it like, well, let's talk about it for 30 minutes today and then let's just move on and not do this anymore. That's not how people learn, right? I mean, people learn by things being integrated into the curriculum consistently. And I think the more you can integrate information about individual differences and characteristics in and acceptance, the better off the environment's going to be.
I love that you brought up bringing other children into the conversation, because I feel that either with people who stutter or people with autism or any other communication disorder, it's kind of this taboo thing.
Yep.
That it's not supposed to be talked about, and we know that there's a difference between person A and person B, but we're just not going to talk about it. And I feel like that kind of pigeonholes these people that have experiences, and it kind of almost cultivates an environment that endorses bullying and
Absolutely
endorses negative feelings about it. But by bringing it out in the open and talking about it from the beginning, then everyone is in on the conversation. Everyone understands. And I feel like that's a big missing piece, is when you don't understand something, it's when you make judgments. Just as a human, we all make judgments, but we perceive it in our own way and we develop our own opinions about it. So by having that conversation out in the open, out front, it empowers the individual to own what it is about them that makes them unique and makes them valuable. But then it also brings in typically developing children or someone who doesn't have a disorder to know that it's okay to be different. And there are probably things about you too that are different from your peers, and you're all kind of on the same page.
Yeah, I think that's a challenge that sometimes people have, is they say, well, we're going to work on awareness of this certain characteristic, whether it's autism, stuttering, and I'm going to bring this child up in front of the room and talk about why they're different. That doesn't help anybody. That just singles them out more, right? Because in reality, everybody is different. Well, one of the things that I've always done with my kids who stutter in therapy when they're being teased and bullied is I'll sit down with them and I'll say, okay, let's pick 7 random people in your class. And they say, okay, I say, okay, I want you to write down something about all 7 of them that you can make fun of them for. And they do that. And then I say, okay, do you make fun of them for those things? And they say, no. And I say, okay, well, why don't you make fun of them for those things? Well, because that wouldn't be a good thing to do. And so that really helps them to see that when other people are doing that, it's not about you, it's about them. Because you could do that for somebody else too, but you choose not to because you know it's not the right thing to do. And I think that having those discussions is also really important because let's be honest, everybody has something that you could make fun of. And I think whether or not people do that is not really dependent on the person who has that characteristic. It's dependent on the other people around them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing that because I feel that that's something that we can all integrate into our advocacy. We have a lot of individuals who watch and who have followed us on social media who are also advocates for their own causes. So I feel like that exercise alone can translate to so many different topics and areas. Thank you so much, Craig. We have really enjoyed this conversation and to get to know you more and share your perspectives with our audience. So thank you so much for being here with us today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Of course. Thank you everyone for watching, and we will be back next week on Sunday for Spectrum Sundays at 1 o'clock.